Hello, I'm Michael Kenney. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi, and welcome to ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman. You know, a lot of people think they're too old or it's too late for them to learn how to play an instrument. So I created ForBassPlayersOnly.com for people mostly over 50 who want to play bass, because I believe you're never too old and it's never too late to experience the joy and the pleasure of making music. ForBassPlayersOnly.com. That's what we're all about. We've got a very, very interesting guest this week, Michael Kenney. He does play bass and he does a lot of other stuff too. He's recently retired from a 40-plus year association with Iron Maiden, where he was the band's keyboard player and also bass tech to none other than Steve Harris. Michael is a fifth-generation Northern Californian Irish American with some Swiss heritage who once gave a synthesizer lesson to Quincy Jones. Who the hell are you, man? I mean, welcome, Michael Kenney. Good to have you.
Hello. Who am I? That's a deep question. I'm not sure myself.
Well, we were talking offline about a great YouTube interview you did with Tim Starachi of Tech 21 and also the band Why Not. And you touched on some of your early days, your Northern California days, your stints with the piano, trumpet, keyboards, and then tech stuff, LA, London, Steve Harris, Iron Maiden, British Lion. Can you connect some of the dots for us? I'm interested, and I'm sure our audience would like to know a little bit about your musical background, how you were first exposed to music. You come from a musical family, parents, brothers and sisters, records playing, things like that. So how would you describe the early days, your musical upbringing?
No musicians in the family at all. I started playing trumpet when I was 7 in school bands. To a degree, I almost forget about it, but I was in the California State Junior Honor Band, probably when I was about 10 or so. But then on my 11th birthday, I got home from seeing Elvis's new movie, Viva Las Vegas. And in the living room was a Silvertone electric guitar with an amp in the case. And that was where it all began. That would have been 1964. The Beatles had already hit, and I was a Beatles freak for about 2 weeks until I saw the Stones, and then I went that direction. Played guitar. I had my first band a year later when I was 12. I was playing guitar and singing, and I got my best friend to go buy a bass, and I had to show him where to put his fingers, and that was the only thing. He still doesn't play this day, but we still talk all the time. Yeah, I played guitar in that. And then there was a singer in town, Freddie O'Quinn Jr., who I always try and mention. He's no longer with us. And he was the greatest singer. And this guy was Little Richard, James Brown, Booker T, and kind of all rolled into one. And he was in a band whose bass player was going to Hawaii with his parents for the weekend. So I thought, if I get a bass, then I can play with them. The same time, this just came up yesterday. I saw somebody posted, "We got to get out of this place" by the Animals, which was the first thing that got me into playing bass. It was almost like that song single-handedly. I got to do that. I got to get a bass so I can do that. And then I can join up with Freddie. So I was more of a bass player for a while there.
But that's, if I'm thinking of the right, that's got an iconic bass opening.
Oh, it does indeed. It does. Exactly.
Yeah.
Chas Chandler was an early, and he discovered Jimi Hendrix too.
Hendrix, right.
So I was mostly a bass player for a while, and Freddie was a soul singer. We didn't even call it R&B or funk or anything back then. It was soul. And I couldn't have had a better education. I mean, I was like 13 years old learning James Brown tunes, you know. In fact, I just remembered, well, I know, but it occurred to me yesterday. There's 2 songs on YouTube, Freddie and the Establishment, that we recorded in his living room, in the midnight hour, in an original of Freddie's. That, I mean, we had a guy recorded. I was in Oroville, California, which is a little town north of Sacramento. And this guy brought his recorder over to Freddie's living room, and we cut these 2 tracks. In fact, the original is really embarrassing to me because my mom worked in a bank, and it was a Friday when banks were open late on Friday, and we were in a hurry to get to the recording, so much so that I didn't even bother to tune my bass as I pulled it out of the case. And when I listen to that track now, it's like, you know.
If the bass is out of tune, the whole band's out of tune.
Well, yeah. I mean, back then, bass is, you know, it was in tune when I bought it. And usually basses didn't really go out of tune, but it slightly did. And I still can't listen to that track.
Well, the kind of music you're describing, it makes me wonder, were you listening intently to the radio to pick out the bass lines, or did you want to hear everything, what the guitar was doing, what the drums were doing? What were you, how were you?
Freddie gave me records to learn. In fact, the very first thing he did was gave me the top 3 soul tunes of the day, which were Cool Jerk, Cold Sweat, and In the Midnight Hour.
Okay.
And it was like, well, give me a call when you got him down. And I called him back 2 or 3 hours later and said, I can do this, you know.
Well, you got bitten by the music bug pretty early. Did you?
Oh, I did.
Have in mind at that age that, were you thinking you might want to make a career out of music?
Oh, I presumed it's what I would do. Like I say, the bass was a sideline. I was already a hardcore Jeff Beck freak by then. When I heard the Yardbirds, I just went, wow, what's that? You know? So straight away, I had 2 major iconic aspects, you know, in that I was a soul bass player who wanted to be Jeff Beck, you know, and Brian Jones. I was also really into Brian Jones.
Yeah, he doesn't get talked about as much as I think he should be. He was really the founder of the Rolling Stones.
He was indeed. And the main thing that I got from Brian, besides a sense of fashion, I took after that too. But he didn't seem to be any one thing. He played whatever. And that started me on my task of, you know, because I consider myself a utility man. I'm equipped to play just about anything. And yeah, I mean, I have guitars, I have basses, I have drums, I have keyboards, I have trumpets, I have saxophones. Not that I can play either one of them particularly well these days. Yeah, I'm kind of all over the shop. But then when I went to work for Maiden, you know, that was over 40 years ago. And when you're a backline tech for a band, people don't really want to know about what you want to do. You know, your job is to do what they need you to do. And I got away from it, and which is kind of sad. It was just one of those forks in the road where I went the path of the job and paying bills. And it kept me busy enough that I never really pursued my own path in that respect.
I'm curious about something. You mentioned Jeff Beck. I interviewed Phil Chen, I don't know, 3 times or something like that.
Yeah.
From Jamaica. And he said that they were looking for work. So he moved to London and he thought he'd be there for about 6 months. And I think he ended up staying for like 18 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So what about your story? Did you think it was going to be a long-term thing when you went to England? I know we're skipping around some. But...
No, in fact, I went to work for a sound company over there in LA. Since I'm a guy who has so much gear, a band came over to London, from London, with a snare drum and a Les Paul on visitors' visas. They didn't have any equipment. and they didn't have the budget to go to like SIR to rent everything. They were at a rehearsal studio, and my friend Frankie Benelli, rest in peace, suggested that they might call me and I might have the gear that they needed to play gigs. And sure enough, I supplied everything they needed to play. Plus I had a van and a PA. And so I was the one-man crew, hire company, what have you. The manager of the band had a sound company in London that his brother was in the band, and he came to LA with him to try to help out. And he needed a couple of guys with his PA in England and asked, did I want to go to London? And of course, I wanted to go to London. So I went to London and got there, and they said, you're going to be out with this band, Iron Maiden, and this band called Girl, who I'd never heard of either one of them. And Girl is Phil Collen from Def Leppard and Phil Lewis from LA Guns. So I did that, and halfway through the tour, one of the guitar techs twisted his ankle, and it was a really ball breaker tour. It was 48 dates in 52 days on a 52-seater coach with occasional bed and breakfasts along the way.
Sounds more like an ankle breaker tour.
Yeah. But since they were down a guitar tech, and I was the only guy on the crew who knew anything about guitars. And there's another long story. So I wasn't as busy with the PA company as my boss had expected me to be. So I started looking after Dave Murray as well, in addition to being the monitor engineer for the support band and the third man on the PA crew. But then that tour finished, and Maiden was going to Europe to support Kiss. And I wasn't getting along with one of the guys from the sound company. So
excuse me, this would have been about what year?
1980. Maiden. Well, the tour we were on was Maiden's first headline tour in England.
Their maiden voyage?
Yep.
Just full of them today.
Yep, pretty much. Well, they had been around doing.
You have a snare drum in that room somewhere for me?
It's up in the attic. That one. Now I have a studio downtown. That's where all the noisy toys are.
Okay.
There's guitars and basses and such here, and a few keyboards. But
all right. So I don't want to get you off track from the story.
Yeah. So I left the sound company and just went to work for Maiden to support Kiss on this tour. And we got back to London. I had been living with the director of the sound company. And since I didn't work for him anymore, it didn't stand that I should be living in his house. And I didn't have anywhere to live. Maiden didn't really have the budget to keep me around. They had some local guys on a crew that were enough. They were going in to do their second album. And I went, well, I guess I'm done. So I came home. I was working for a studio synth player named Michael Boddicker, who, that put me in touch. That's where the Quincy Jones thing comes in, and a lot of others. So I was back in LA being a studio tech, basically. And then I got a call from the sound guy for Maiden. I went over with. He was an American also. And he called, and Steve's tech had gotten hurt, and could I come to Minneapolis tomorrow? And I was like, okay. And it was supposed to be for 3 months. And for several years after that, I was saying they hired me for 3 months 3 years ago, and I've been leaving ever since.
Well, you had worked as a guitar tech. Can a guitar tech also work as a bass tech, or did you have some experience with that too, or how did it go?
Well, I'm a guitar player and a bass player, so they're both natural to me. Okay. And I had never really teched either one. I mean, I'd teched myself, but I hadn't been out teching somebody else. But we're talking over 40 years ago, things weren't quite the way they are now.
Yeah.
you know. In fact, that was one of the, as I was getting out of it, one of the things that I brought up was the fact that some of these guys on the crew weren't even born when I started with this band.
Yep.
And the whole industry had gone through so many changes. And I was pretty, I was an old school survivor as opposed to a new school technician, where were we? Yeah.
Minnesota.
Yeah, I went back to work with them. I was doing Steve's bass. And then it just carried on and carried on and carried on. Steve is pretty much the main guy with the band, and it is known that he can be rather picky about what he wants. He's very, very tunnel visioned in that he has a focus and that's it. And I seemed to keep him happy, which kept management happy. And they wanted to keep me around for a while, and they did.
You talking about picky about setup or adjustment or action or
just the way he wants things to be. It's as I mentioned to you before, Steve's bass, he sweats a lot, and he only uses one bass. I mean, the bass that he plays is the same bass he's been playing his entire career. Unless something goes wrong with that, then I have another one very, very similar to it to give him.
What kind of bass is it?
Precision, mid-70s, very heavy. In fact, there's a story there, in fact, that might interest some of you guys. I never knew why they were so heavy. And Fender Custom Shop sent one of their guys along, and he was speccing out Steve's bass to make a copy of it. And as it happens, his dad had been the head of Fender in the 70s. And I'm having a metal block here. What's his name? Jason. Sorry, I know it's Jason. Jason Smith. And Dan Smith ran Fender. And he said, Dad, I can't find a blank of alder to make this bass as heavy as it needs to be. His dad said, oh, does that happen to be mid-70s by any chance? And it's like, yeah. Chuckle. In the mid-70s, Fender had a problem with their alder supply, and they discovered that Western big leaf maple looked about like alder, and they could make their clear finish basses with it and get away with it. They just happened to be really heavy. But because of that, maple has a sound of its own. So I think Steve just picked up on that, though he didn't realize why, or the fact that it had anything to do with the fact they were so heavy. But all of Steve's precisions are of that kind of, I mean, they're like 13 pounds. Yeah. Oh, you should see Steve's straps. I mean, Steve's straps are something that I developed over the years that are 2 layers of foam with a pad over the top of that. And
what kind of strings does he play?
Rotosound.
Mm-hmm.
Rotosound flats. In fact, now they're Steve Harris SH77s. Though they are essentially the same thing as a jazz bass, the regular Rotosound flat. We just gave them a name and changed some cosmetics. Well, they were going to change the formula of their flat wound. That was how it all came about. They were going to go to a stainless steel, which I really liked. They were lovely and bright and stayed that way longer.
I visited a factory once.
Yeah.
Kent.
Yep. 7 Oaks. And it's been there forever. And it's the epitome of a family-owned business.
Yep.
And Jason, who runs it, grew up under his dad, James Howe Industries. You can see pictures of James with Hendrix and John Entwistle and all these people.
Yeah, Jason's the one that invited me out.
Yeah, Jason's great. Hi, Jason, if you happen to see this, we're in touch and we're Facebook buddies and we message back.
I think I am too with him.
Yeah.
So tell me something else about Steve Harris that we may not know.
I doubt there's much you don't know about him. I mean, it's been over 40 years and there's no lack of press. He's private. He's not a musician as such. I mean, he's not a muso. He's one story I tell. He came back. We were in New York, and he came back with a red, like a red stained Precision. I said, "Where'd you get that?" And when I bought it, where? At Manny's. It's like, you went to Manny's? And I was just amazed that he actually went into a music store, let alone looked at basses and bought one. That's just, he's not the guy who has room full of guitars. That has a little closet. There might be 10 basses in there or something, and half of those are things that people have given him or made him or something. But he's not a guy who has tons of equipment. Well, like I say, he plays the one bass he plays is the bass he plays. Mm-hmm. It's had several different finishes, so people think that it's different basses. But the famous West Ham bass that he plays now, the white one, was the Blue Sparkle one before. And before it was Blue Sparkle, I think it was black and or white. But all of those basses are the same bass that he plays to this day.
Let's talk about the Sans Amp.
Steve has a side band called British Lion, which doesn't operate on the level that Iron Maiden does. And we were getting ready to do a tour, kind of a world tour, flying around, but we couldn't take all the gear. And we needed something that could supply what Steve wanted. And as a story kind of famously goes, Doug Pinnick is a friend of mine, the bass player of King's X, and he had his Sans Amp. And I thought, well, if that can do Doug's sound, we can probably dial it back and get something like Steve's sound, because Doug's is over the top. And sure enough, I got one and I was playing with it, and yeah, this is pretty good. Then I was looking at old Tech 21 brochures and such, and I saw that they had once made a guitar pedal with an electro voice speaker simulator in it. And Steve is famous for using his EVs. And rightly so. I think there's no better bass speaker. So I called Tech 21. That was when I met Dale. I kind of cold called and said, look, Doug Pinnick showed me his pedal. I work for Steve Harris. We're needing to do this tour. And I was wondering, could you put the EV simulator in the Doug pedal? And they went, well, no, it's actually, that thing is pretty full. There's no room to put anything else in it. But we could make you something else. And that's where the Steve Harris pedal came about. It's not a copy of the Doug, but the Doug was the inspiration to go into getting one made. And Andrew Barta, the engineer, owner of Tech 21, is very good. And the funny thing was, I didn't even know who I was talking to. Dale put me on the phone to an engineer in the back room, and I'm thinking that I'm just talking to some Eastern European backroom engineer, and we go through the whole thing and we get it all developed, and they sent out the prototype, and it was really good. And I had to send something back to Dale. So I was looking up their address, and I was online. And only while looking at Tech 21's online page did I realize that Andrew that I had been talking to happened to be Andrew Barta, who happened to own the company. I had no idea. but yeah, that's where the pedal came out, and they did a great job of it. And because Steve is not a fan of SVTs, nor am I, primarily because they have a single mid-range. It's switchable, but there's only one. And I've always found the secret to the bass sound that I want to get anyway is to have two mids to cut back the woofy low mid and to accentuate the brighter high mid. And so that's why the Steve's pedal has that.
I interviewed Andrew Barta at the NAMM show in 2019.
Mm.
I am not really a tech guy, but running a media company, you learn certain things about software and such. But I asked him, what is the Sans Amp? Because I've interviewed so many Tech 21 artists. Everybody loves the Sans Amp. And my understanding from what he told me is it kind of consolidates the signal flow so you can get the sound how you want it, and you don't have to be at the mercy of whoever's running the board or the house or any of that. Is that a pretty accurate layman's description and understanding?
Yeah, I would guess so. I mean, the first time I encountered one, Steve's daughter's band was out on tour with us, and their bass player, Randy Gregg, used a Sans Amp. And I didn't even really look into it or anything. I just thought, oh, that's that little pedal that Randy uses. And then as time went on, I learned, one of the biggest keys, I think, to what Andrew does is there are these little tiny boxes that in these days would be digital, but they're not digital. Sans Amps are analog. They just act like they're digital. And I think that's the biggest key to what they do is they're the real deal. And for guitar, I've got 23 Marshall amps and how many others, right? But these days, my guitar amp is my Richie Kotzen fly rig,
Andrew said in the early days that they put the controls on the inside of the pedal because they didn't want people messing with them. But a lot of bass players said, we'd really like to be able to just, tweak it a little bit here. So they started putting the controls on the outside.
Yeah, well, that is sometimes a problem with engineers. They make something that they think is the bee's knees for them. This is what you want. It's like, well, no, it's not really exactly what I want,
Oh, spot.
Yeah. So, I think it's a good idea that it has controls on the outside.
Yeah. Well, I think most people do. Let's talk a little bit more about you, because whenever I talk to somebody who's retired, how's it going? What are you doing? They say, oh, I'm busier now that I'm retired than I was when I was working. What about you? Is it?
I'm not.
What's keeping you busy? What do you?
I just retired in September, so I'm still getting used to it. In fact, it often on the road, as time went on with Maiden, we weren't on tour all the time anymore. We'd go out for 4 or 5 months, but that would still mean that I would have several months at home. And I still haven't gotten over the feeling that this is just a break. I have to get used to the fact that, and there are times I have this little tickle in the back of my head. Oh, I got to get this done. I got to do this. But then I realize, wait, I have no time frame. And so
that could be good or bad.
Yeah. Well, I could get very deep here. I'm having some ideas about being a human being on the planet Earth. And without
that works out.
Well, without getting into it too deep, I don't think there's anything to work out. I think a lot of our ambitions and requirements for life are things that we've done to give us a purpose to be here. ideally, I have a roof over my head. I have food in the kitchen. I have a car that has gas in it. Um, there's not, what else do I need, really? But we've made, well, I gotta say, it's a deep subject that this isn't really the medium for it, but I don't really worry about it too much. I think as I get used to being at home a little longer, then maybe I'll start, like for one, I have 2 studios downtown here that unfortunately are connected by the Santa Monica Freeway, which if I don't go before 2:00 in the afternoon, there isn't much use to try and get down there until about 8:00 that night. Yeah. And I'm a late night person anyway, which is why we're doing this at 2:30, because I didn't get up until 12:30, Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up. Yeah.
Can you say something to the bass players? But for Bass Players Only is really a bass instruction site.
I know. When I saw that, I thought, am I the guy to be here?
Well, I also do. I've done over 800 interviews with bass players, interesting stories like yours. Mm-hmm. But most of the people that are coming are men. There's some women too, but mostly men in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They're not trying to make a career out of it. They want to play some classic rock riffs or some blues shuffles or some walking bass. They want to get together and they just want to do it to have fun. And a lot of times, they have arthritis or tendonitis, things that happen to us when we get into our 50s, 60s, 70s. So
I'm hitting 70 this summer. So
good for you. You look wonderful. But I say that to give you a context.
Yeah.
So in that context, what advice do you have for somebody who wants to learn bass, somebody like that?
Well, all I can say is just do it. You get a bass and start putting your fingers down. On YouTube, there's everything you could possibly want to learn on YouTube, which didn't exist when I was a kid. When I wanted to learn something, I had to get the record and practically wear it out, moving the arm. And what was that again? But now, go on YouTube and there's more instruction, better instruction than was even available. In person when I was young, I had a couple of teachers that showed me stuff, but and also the art it can be daunting now. Bass players are just light years beyond where they were back then. And in fact, it's turning into a solo instrument, which I don't think it was ever meant to be particularly. If somebody is into that, I'm sure fine.
There are 2 things that you just said that scare me a little bit. The first one is YouTube. Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff on YouTube, but there's also a lot of bad stuff and dangerous stuff with technique and things that you shouldn't be doing, shouldn't be learning. And the problem with YouTube is that you have to sift through so much to find what's good and what's going to help you. And you have to test it because you don't know if it's going to help you.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, there's some ridiculously technically talented people on YouTube. And my fear, and I'm seeing it happen already, is that people think that that's what being a bass player means. That's what it means to be a bass player. And that's not the truth. You got to lay down the groove. You got to let them read. You've got to keep it simple. If the song needs it to be simple, you can play it busy. If the song needs it to be busy, but people don't know that. And that's why I'm concerned for, I have a site and I think I'm teaching what you need to know to get out there. And I have a course called Chops. I have, technique building stuff, but there's always a caveat. And there's always, with great chops comes great responsibility and knowing So, yeah, there's some good in there if you're not careful, but my fear and my concern is that it can also be very dangerous.
That was my point. Like I say, I grew up, well, playing soul early on. So that's as to the point as you can get, you know. There is some, there are some chops involved in there. You know, it can be interesting, but it's not what it's all about. You know, we got to get out of this place was a fancy bass part at the time, you know. Your point is exactly what I was saying about it all. There's 10-year-old kids out there playing Jocko, you know. And I've got a friend that practices night and day, shredding to the, you know, to the hilt. I said, great, you can play 10,000 notes a second. Now play one and rip my heart out, and I'll believe you. And that's kind of where I am, you know. I used to like fancy stuff, but now I just don't really care, you know. I used to be all about buying gear. Now I'm all about selling it.
I love it. Well, my signature sign-off question is typically, what would you be if you weren't a bass player? And you're so much more than a bass player. So what would you be if you were not in music? What do you think you would have done, or what do you think you would do?
Good question. And when I was younger, I was rather into fashion. I can probably blame Brian Jones for that. And I might have gone that way. In high school, my girlfriend was the seamstress of the school. And I mean, it was the 60s.
Yeah.
And I wore some pretty outrageous stuff to school because the fabric store was the limit. My girlfriend could make me anything I wanted. Besides that, I don't really know. I was always into techie stuff. In fact, one of the very first sort of jobs I actually had was an audio vision, an AV tech at Cal Poly, where I was an electronic engineering student. So it would have been probably in the technical field of some form anyway.
Why does that not surprise me?
I never really thought about it. You know, it's, like I say, I started collecting gear when I was 11. So, and it was paper routes and lawn mowing and washing cars and selling greeting cards just so I could get a bigger amp, you know.
Well, you've got a fascinating story, and you must have so many stories to tell. Maybe we'll do a follow-up and you can
people keep telling me I need to write a book. Now, whether I get around to actually doing that is, yeah. And then there's, okay, well, how much do I want to put in there? And it could be that big,
yeah,
or it could be that big. You know, so
I challenge you to do it.
I'm actually a photographer as well. I have something like 45,000 pictures in my computer.
Wow.
And
I hope you back them up on a hard drive or in the cloud.
Oh, they're backed up several places.
Well, that's important. Well, Mike,
Yeah.
this has been great. This has been fascinating. I was looking forward to this. I was excited. I'm glad we had a chance to do it. Thank you for sharing the great stories. I wish you much luck and success with, I guess you'd call it Act 3 of your life.
Yeah. Well, my main focus these days is making myself get out of bed. So,
well, good luck with that.
Yeah, I managed to do it most days. So,
that's good. Seriously, thanks again very much for sharing this time with us. And
Yep.
Our audience got a lot out of it as well. You're a fun guy. You're inspiring. You tell good stories and good jokes and all that stuff. So thanks very much. Our special guest today, Michael Kenney. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman of ForBassPlayersOnly.com. A lot of people think they're too old or it's too late for them to learn to play an instrument. So I created ForBassPlayersOnly.com for people mostly over 50 who want to play bass, because I believe you're never too old and it's never too late to experience the joy and the pleasure of making music. ForBassPlayersOnly.com. That's what we're all about. I will see you all next week, same time, same place. In the meantime, let's play bass.